In the peaceful town of Glenview, nestled among tree-lined streets and quiet suburban homes, the Hargrave family lived a life many would envy. Mark Hargrave, a reliable and loving father, was the anchor of their small household. He worked as a mechanic at a local garage, and his days were filled with the clank of tools and the hum of engines. But when he came home, the house was always warm, filled with the smell of fresh cookies, laughter, and the sound of his daughter Emma's chatter. Emma Hargrave was 8 years old, and she adored her father. He was her hero, always ready to play make-believe games in the backyard or tell her stories before bed. His deep voice was the soundtrack of her childhood, his arms the safest place she knew. Emma's bunny, a soft stuffed animal that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember, sat on her pillow every night, its fur matted from all the hugs and comfort it had given her over the years. Samantha, Mark's wife and Emma's mother, worked as a nurse at the local hospital. She often worked long shifts, her mind occupied with caring for others, but when she was home, the family was complete. Samantha would bake cookies, help Emma with her homework, and spend quiet evenings with Mark, talking about everything and nothing. They were a close-knit family, their lives intertwined with love, laughter, and a sense of normalcy. One warm summer evening, after a busy day, Mark kissed Emma goodnight and tucked her into bed, just like he always did. The fireflies outside the window cast a soft glow across the room, and Emma snuggled under her covers, clutching her bunny tightly. The night felt peaceful. The world outside her bedroom door so quiet it almost seemed like nothing could go wrong. But everything was about to change. Before the sun even rose, Emma was jolted awake by a sudden flash of red and blue lights, lighting up her bedroom window. Her heart raced as she heard the sounds of sirens wail down the street, piercing the stillness of the night. She rushed to the window and pulled back the curtains, her breath catching in her throat as she saw police cars lined up outside her house, their lights flashing like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She barely had time to process what was happening before she saw her father, Mark, being led out of their house in handcuffs. "Daddy!" Emma screamed, running down the stairs in her pajamas, her voice trembling with confusion and fear. "What's happening?" Samantha was already at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale and drawn. She reached out to Emma, pulling her back into her arms. "Emma, go back to your room, sweetheart," Samantha said, her voice cracking. "Please, go back to your room." "Mom, what's going on? Why is Daddy being arrested?" "Just do what I say, Emma," Samantha whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's going to be okay. I promise." But Emma couldn't believe it. Nothing felt okay. Nothing could be okay when her father, her hero, was being taken away by the police. Mark had been accused of a terrible crime, a crime so severe that it ripped apart the world Emma knew. Their neighbor, Mr. Wilson, had been found in his home, severely beaten and left for dead. The police had evidence that pointed straight to Mark. Witnesses said they saw him fleeing the scene the night of the attack. Mark's fingerprints were found on the back door of Mr. Wilson's house. His wallet was discovered in the yard near the victim's front door. The accusation shook their family to its core. Emma's world turned upside down, and suddenly the people around her who had once been so friendly turned away. Neighbors who had once waved hello now crossed the street to avoid them. At school, Emma's classmates gave her pitying looks. They whispered behind her back, making her feel like an outcast. "Her dad's a criminal. She's guilty too." Those were the whispers that followed Emma through the halls. She overheard them at lunch, in the bathroom, and even during recess. Her classmates' parents warned them to stay away from her, like she carried some sort of invisible guilt. Samantha was struggling too. She worked long shifts at the hospital to make ends meet, but the weight of the situation was suffocating. The legal fees for Mark's defense were piling up, and it felt like everything was falling apart. Emma's mother tried to keep it all together, but she was losing hope, drowning in bills and fear. Emma tried to be brave. She tried to pretend that everything was normal, even though her world was shattering around her. At night, she heard her mother crying behind closed doors, and it broke her heart. Her dad was innocent. She knew it deep down, but no one else believed it. She felt helpless, but she wasn't ready to give up. One afternoon, Emma was outside in the backyard, playing with her bunny when she overheard a conversation between two police officers. They were standing by the fence, talking quietly as they looked over at the Hargrave house. Emma crouched down behind the bushes, listening carefully. "I don't know, man," one officer said in a low voice. "Something doesn't feel right about this whole thing." The other officer shrugged. "Maybe, but we've got the DA's word. The fingerprints are a big deal." "Yeah, but what about those other break-ins? Same neighborhood, same MO?" the first officer countered. "Nobody's been arrested for those, and they all happened around the same time. What if we missed something?" Emma's heart raced as she listened. She didn't hear the rest of their conversation, but what she did hear was enough to send her mind spinning. What if her dad didn't do it? What if someone else was involved? What if they were wrong about him? She ran inside to tell her mother, but Samantha was too tired to listen. "Not now, Emma," she said, rubbing her forehead in exhaustion. "I can't deal with this right now." Emma wanted to argue, to tell her mother that she had a feeling something was wrong. But she didn't. Instead, she held her thoughts in, her mind racing with the possibility that there was more to the case than the police realized. That night, as she lay in bed, she clutched her bunny tightly and made a decision. If no one else could figure it out, maybe she could. Maybe she could be the one to find the truth. The days following Mark's arrest felt like a blur for Emma. The house was quieter now, the usual hum of everyday life replaced with an unsettling silence. Samantha went to work each day, but when she came home, her face looked even more drawn and tired. She no longer had the energy to bake cookies or talk about her day. Instead, she spent her time on the phone with lawyers and trying to make sense of the ever-growing pile of bills that seemed to be swallowing them whole. Emma, meanwhile, had trouble focusing on anything. Her friends at school kept their distance, some avoiding eye contact altogether, while others shot her looks of sympathy, which felt worse than anything else. She missed her dad terribly. Even though he was innocent, his absence left a gaping hole in their home. Every morning she'd wake up, expecting to hear his footsteps coming down the hallway, but there was only emptiness. The courtroom drama began soon after, but Emma was unsure how much of it she could bear. Samantha, worried about what Emma might witness, was hesitant to let her attend. She was protective, not wanting her daughter to see her father in such a painful situation. But Emma's insistence finally won out. "Please, Mom," she had begged, her eyes wide with determination. "I have to be there." Reluctantly, Samantha agreed, though she made it clear that Emma would be sitting at the back of the courtroom, far from the lawyers and witnesses. They arrived early on the first day of the trial, the air heavy with tension as they walked into the courthouse. The room buzzed with activity, but as soon as the judge entered, a silence fell over everyone. Emma clutched her bunny tightly under her arm as she sat in a corner of the courtroom, watching everything unfold. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp features, stood confidently before the jury, painting a grim picture of Mark. He spoke of the attack on Mr. Wilson and pointed to the physical evidence that linked Mark to the crime. Each witness testified against him, and with each passing moment, Emma's hope seemed to shrink. Her dad was being painted as a guilty man, and there was nothing she could do to change it. But then, on the third day of the trial, something happened that changed everything. During a break in the proceedings, Emma overheard a conversation between the prosecutor and a colleague. They were standing in the hallway, speaking in low tones, but Emma's sharp ears caught something important. "Where's the security footage?" the prosecutor asked, his voice sounding frustrated. The colleague shrugged. "It got damaged in the break-in. We thought it was irrelevant." "That's a key piece of evidence," the prosecutor muttered, glancing nervously toward the courtroom. "Without that footage, we might not have enough to convict him." Emma's mind raced. She remembered something about the security camera at Mr. Wilson's house. Her mother had mentioned it when they first heard about the attack, how the camera had been broken during the burglary, but they hadn't thought much of it. Emma also remembered seeing Mr. Johnson, an older neighbor, messing with the camera in the days leading up to the attack. He had been working on his own house when Emma had noticed him fiddling with the wires near the security camera. Could it be? Could this Mr. Johnson be involved? Suddenly, Emma felt a surge of determination. She had to do something. She had to say something. The pieces were starting to come together, and she wasn't going to sit quietly while her dad was accused of something he didn't do. Later that afternoon, Emma worked up the courage to speak to Mark's lawyer, a kind man named Mr. Grayson. He had been spending a lot of time at the courthouse, poring over the case files, but when Emma tugged at his sleeve and whispered urgently, he paused and knelt down to her level. "Emma?" he asked softly. "What is it? Are you all right?" I know something," Emma stammered, her voice shaking. "I think I saw Mr. Johnson near the camera. He was messing with it before it broke. I think he might know something." Mr. Grayson blinked, clearly surprised by the little girl's words. "Mr. Johnson?" he repeated, his brow furrowing. "Are you sure?" Emma nodded. "I'm sure. I saw him." Mr. Grayson looked toward Samantha, who was sitting across the room, her face a mix of worry and disbelief. "Thank you, Emma," he said softly. "We'll look into it. You've done a good job." Emma sat back in her seat, clutching her bunny even tighter. She had spoken up, but now she had to wait. She watched as Mr. Grayson went to speak to the prosecutor, though she couldn't hear their conversation. The room was full of whispers, and Emma's heart pounded as she wondered if her small voice could really make a difference. The trial dragged on for several more days, each one more exhausting than the last. The evidence against Mark seemed overwhelming. The prosecutor continued to paint a picture of a man who had motive and opportunity, and Emma began to fear that nothing she could say would ever be enough. Her hope flickered, and then, on the final day of the trial, everything changed. During a break, Mr. Grayson came to speak to Emma and Samantha. His expression was serious, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes. "We've found something," Mr. Grayson said, his voice low but urgent. "The security camera footage. There's a chance it wasn't just broken. It was tampered with. We also found something else interesting." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "What?" "Mr. Johnson," Mr. Grayson said slowly. "He has a history with Mr. Wilson. They had a dispute over some property not long before the attack. We think we might be onto something." Samantha looked between Emma and Mr. Grayson, her face softening with disbelief. "So, you think Mr. Johnson might be involved?" "I think there's a very good chance," Mr. Grayson replied. Emma felt a rush of hope. She had done it. She had helped uncover a clue that could change everything. But her work wasn't done yet. She still had one more thing to do: take the stand and tell the truth. The days leading up to Emma's testimony felt like an eternity. The weight of everything, her father's arrest, the trial, the mounting pressure to find the truth, seemed to hang in the air like an unrelenting storm. Emma barely slept, her mind constantly racing, going over every little detail of what she had seen and heard. She kept replaying the conversation with Mr. Grayson in her head, knowing that her revelation about Mr. Johnson had opened a door. But now, she had to walk through it. On the morning of her testimony, the courtroom was packed. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of murmurs echoed through the room. Emma, dressed in a small, neat dress, clutched her stuffed bunny tightly under her arm as she walked into the courtroom with her mother. Samantha's face was pale, but her eyes held a mixture of pride and worry. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a stern expression, called the court to order, his voice carrying across the room. Emma's heart pounded as she took her seat at the back of the courtroom. The rows of seats in front of her were filled with people: lawyers, jurors, reporters. Everyone was waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The prosecutor, a man named Mr. Collins, stood up and adjusted his glasses. He glanced over at Emma, who sat in her seat, quietly clutching her bunny, looking smaller than ever in that huge room. He cleared his throat before speaking to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "I request that we continue the proceedings. We are ready to proceed with the next witness." The judge nodded, and Mr. Collins turned to the defense table where Mr. Grayson sat. There was a brief pause before Mr. Grayson stood up, his calm demeanor in sharp contrast to the nervous tension in the air. He looked at Emma and gave her a reassuring nod. It was time. Emma felt her palms sweat as she slowly stood up. Her heart thudded in her chest, and for a moment she felt like she couldn't breathe. But then she remembered her father's smile, the way he had always told her that she was strong. She was brave. She could do this. "Miss Hargrave," Mr. Grayson said softly as he led her to the witness stand, "do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Emma nodded. "I do." She sat down on the witness stand, her legs dangling just above the seat, and her bunny clutched in her arms like a lifeline. She felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her, some curious, some skeptical, and some with a faint look of pity. But Emma wasn't afraid. She was there to speak the truth, and that's all that mattered. The prosecutor, Mr. Collins, stood up and approached the stand. He eyed Emma carefully, as if sizing her up. "Miss Hargrave," he began, his tone sharp, "can you tell the court why you're here today?" Emma swallowed, gathering her thoughts. "I'm here because my dad didn't do it," she said, her voice small but firm. "I know he didn't. He's innocent." A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom. Mr. Collins raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "And how do you know that, Miss Hargrave?" Emma took a deep breath, her fingers tightly gripping the worn fur of her bunny. "Because I saw something," she said softly. "I saw Mr. Johnson messing with the camera outside Mr. Wilson's house. It wasn't just broken. He was fixing it before the attack happened. I think he might have had something to do with what happened to Mr. Wilson." The room went silent. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next words to fall. Emma felt a surge of hope. She had said it. She had spoken the truth. But she knew the prosecutor wouldn't just let it go. He would try to poke holes in her story. And he did. Mr. Collins stood up sharply, his voice rising as he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I object. This is a child's testimony. How can we rely on anything she says? She doesn't understand the law. She doesn't know how to analyze evidence. She's just repeating what someone told her." The judge banged his gavel, silencing the room. "Order! Order in the court!" he called, his voice authoritative. "The witness will speak, and we will hear her testimony. Mr. Collins, you may proceed." Mr. Collins, frustrated, turned back to Emma. "Miss Hargrave, can you tell us exactly what you saw? How do you know that Mr. Johnson was tampering with the camera? Did he admit to it?" Emma shook her head, but her voice remained steady. "No, he didn't say anything. But I saw him there. I remember because it was right before everything happened. And I know he was messing with it because when I was playing outside, I saw him standing near the camera, holding something in his hands. I don't know much about cameras, but I know he was doing something to it." The prosecutor frowned, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. "And you expect us to believe that just because you saw him near the camera, that means he's guilty of the crime?" "I'm not saying he's guilty," Emma said, her voice small but unwavering. "But I think it's important. If you look at what he did with the camera, maybe you'll find something. Maybe he did something to it that can help you understand who really hurt Mr. Wilson." The courtroom was quiet, the tension palpable. Emma could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She had said her piece. She had told the truth. And now she had to wait and see if anyone would believe her. Mr. Grayson stood up, his turn to ask questions. "Miss Hargrave," he began, his tone kind and patient, "do you remember when you first realized that your dad was being accused of something he didn't do?" Emma nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Yes," she said softly. "I heard the police talking about it. And I knew my dad wouldn't hurt anyone. He's not that kind of person." "And what did you decide to do about it?" Mr. Grayson asked. "I decided to help," Emma replied, "because I knew my dad needed me." The words hung in the air for a moment before Mr. Grayson turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we believe that Miss Hargrave's testimony is crucial to understanding the truth. We request that the court consider the evidence of Mr. Johnson's actions with the camera and investigate further." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "We will take this under advisement. The court will resume tomorrow." Emma stepped down from the witness stand, her legs shaking. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but it had been harder than she thought. She felt a mixture of relief and fear. She had done her part, but what would happen next? Would the investigation into Mr. Johnson's involvement reveal more? Would it be enough to free her dad? As she sat back down, clutching her bunny tightly in her lap, Emma couldn't help but feel that something big was coming. The courtroom had just begun to buzz with whispers again, and she knew that her words had planted a seed of doubt in their minds. But now it was up to the adults to connect the dots. And Emma could only wait and hope that the truth would finally come to light. The days following Emma's testimony felt like they dragged on forever. Every morning, she would wake up with a knot in her stomach, wondering what new twist would emerge in the trial. The courtroom was like a battleground. Every word spoken had the potential to tip the scales in either direction. Mark's fate was still uncertain, and Emma knew that the truth was still a long way off. Her mother, Samantha, was more nervous than ever. Each time Emma came home from the courthouse, she could see the toll it was taking on her. Samantha tried to stay strong for her daughter, but Emma could see it in her eyes. The exhaustion, the fear, and the hope that one day everything would go back to the way it was before. Mark's defense lawyer, Mr. Grayson, was working tirelessly to unravel the case against him. He had already made progress by following up on the lead Emma had given about Mr. Johnson tampering with the security camera. Investigators had begun questioning the neighbor and examining his alibi. But the courtroom drama continued, and the prosecutor, Mr. Collins, was relentless, still pushing the idea that Mark was the one who had attacked Mr. Wilson. On the fourth day of the trial, something unexpected happened. During a break in the proceedings, Emma overheard a conversation between the prosecutor and one of his colleagues. They were standing near the courtroom doors, speaking in hushed tones, but Emma's sharp ears caught something that made her blood run cold. "Where's the other piece of evidence?" Mr. Collins was asking. The colleague shook his head. "It's still not in the records. We're still working on it." "What do you mean, not in the records? This could be the key we need. Get it in the courtroom. Now," Mr. Collins barked. The words echoed in Emma's mind as she tried to piece together what she had just heard. What evidence were they talking about? What was so important that they were trying to keep it hidden? She couldn't make sense of it, but she felt a sense of urgency in her chest. Whatever it was, it couldn't be good. The next morning, the courtroom filled again, the tension more palpable than ever. Emma sat quietly in her usual spot at the back, clutching her bunny, her mind racing with thoughts of the conversation she had overheard. Mr. Grayson had told her to stay focused, to trust that the truth would come out in the end, but there was a nagging feeling in her gut that something wasn't right. The trial resumed, and the prosecutor called his next witness, a detective named Detective Matthews, who had been assigned to investigate the case. He took the stand confidently, his uniform crisp and his posture rigid. He began to recount the evidence that had been collected against Mark: his fingerprints on the back door, his wallet found near the victim's home, and the statements from the witnesses who claimed they had seen him fleeing the scene. But then, just as things seemed to be solidifying against Mark, something happened that made everyone in the courtroom stop in their tracks. Mr. Grayson stood up and raised his hand, signaling that he wanted to cross-examine the detective. The judge nodded, giving him permission to proceed. "Detective Matthews," Mr. Grayson began, "you testified that the fingerprints found at the scene matched Mr. Hargrave's, correct?" "Yes," the detective replied, his voice steady. "And you also mentioned that his wallet was found near the victim's house." "That's correct." "But," Mr. Grayson continued, his voice growing more pointed, "did you test the wallet for any other fingerprints? Perhaps someone else's?" The courtroom fell silent. Emma felt her heart race as she listened intently, trying to understand where this line of questioning was going. The detective shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, we did test it," Detective Matthews said, his voice slightly wavering. "But the only fingerprints that came back as a match were Mr. Hargrave's." "And did you notice anything unusual about the condition of the wallet?" Mr. Grayson asked, his gaze fixed on the detective. The detective paused, clearly hesitant. "There were some smudges, but nothing that we could confirm as intentional. It looked like the wallet had been handled, but we couldn't tell if someone wiped it clean or if it was just worn out from use." Mr. Grayson turned to the jury, his eyes intense. "So, it's possible that someone planted that wallet at the scene to frame Mr. Hargrave?" The detective hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "It's possible," he admitted, his voice reluctant. Emma felt a surge of hope rush through her. Could this be the breakthrough they had been waiting for? If someone had planted the wallet, it would mean that the evidence against Mark was not as solid as they had thought. Mr. Grayson was getting closer to exposing the cracks in the case. The prosecutor, Mr. Collins, jumped to his feet, his voice sharp. "Objection! This is pure speculation. There's no evidence to suggest that the wallet was planted. It's just a guess." The judge banged his gavel, silencing the room. "Sustained. Mr. Grayson, you will stick to facts, not assumptions." Mr. Grayson nodded, but didn't back down. "Of course, Your Honor," he said calmly. "But the point remains that there is a reasonable doubt about the evidence against my client, and we must explore every possibility to uncover the truth." The judge's gavel struck again, and the room fell into tense silence. The prosecutor scowled, clearly frustrated by the turn of events. Emma's mind was spinning. This was it, the break they had been waiting for. If Mr. Grayson could keep pushing this line of questioning, maybe they could prove that Mark was innocent after all. But it wasn't over yet. They still had to prove that someone else was behind the attack on Mr. Wilson. And Emma knew that the key to unraveling the truth was still out there. As the courtroom adjourned for the day, Emma sat quietly with her mother, her heart heavy with anticipation. They had come so far, but there was still more to uncover. Emma's mind kept returning to the conversation she had overheard between Mr. Collins and his colleague about the hidden evidence. What were they hiding? And why? She couldn't shake the feeling that the most important piece of the puzzle was just out of reach, but she was determined to find it. For her dad. For her family. The truth was out there, and she was going to help bring it to light. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the trial resumed the following day. Emma sat in her usual spot at the back of the room, her bunny still clutched tightly under her arm. Despite the progress they had made, despite the cracks beginning to show in the prosecution's case, Emma couldn't help but feel anxious. Every moment felt like an eternity, and the weight of the trial hung heavily in the air. Mark sat at the defense table, his head resting in his hands, his eyes hollow from exhaustion. Emma's heart ached every time she looked at him. He had always been so strong, so dependable. Seeing him like this, defeated, uncertain, was a pain she couldn't fully understand. But she knew one thing. Her father was innocent. She had to prove it, no matter what. Mr. Grayson, Mark's defense lawyer, was on his feet early that morning, preparing to introduce new evidence. After the questioning of Detective Matthews the day before, things were looking up. The idea that someone might have planted the wallet to frame Mark had started to resonate with the jury, and Emma had the distinct feeling that the prosecutor was beginning to lose control of the narrative. The courtroom fell silent as the judge entered, and the proceedings began. Mr. Collins, the prosecutor, stood up and adjusted his tie before calling his next witness. A chill ran down Emma's spine as she watched the witness make his way to the stand. It was Mr. Johnson, the neighbor she had seen tampering with the security camera. Emma had no idea how things were going to unfold. The entire case had been a tangled web of lies, half-truths, and hidden motives. But now that Mr. Johnson was on the stand, Emma knew that everything was about to change. Mr. Collins began his questioning with his usual sharp tone, his eyes never leaving Mr. Johnson as he spoke. "Mr. Johnson, can you tell the court about your interactions with Mr. Wilson in the weeks leading up to the attack?" Mr. Johnson shifted in his seat, his hands trembling. He had always been an aloof, solitary man. But now, as he faced the courtroom, he seemed even more jittery than Emma had ever seen him. His eyes flickered nervously as he began to speak. "Well, we had a few disagreements," Mr. Johnson muttered, his voice low. "Nothing serious, just small stuff. He owed me money for some repairs I did around his house. That's all." "Money," Mr. Collins repeated, his voice rising. "Can you explain to the court why you felt the need to fix the security camera outside Mr. Wilson's house without his permission?" Mr. Johnson's eyes widened, and Emma could see the beads of sweat beginning to form on his brow. I was just trying to help," he stammered. "The camera was broken, and he kept complaining about it. I figured I could fix it for him." "Did you fix it, Mr. Johnson?" Mr. Collins pressed. "I tried, yes," Mr. Johnson replied, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "But I didn't do much. It wasn't working when I left, that's for sure." "Is it true that you were seen near Mr. Wilson's house the night of the attack?" Mr. Collins asked sharply. Mr. Johnson hesitated. I "I don't know," he muttered, his eyes darting around the room. "Maybe. I don't remember." Emma's heart was pounding in her chest. Mr. Johnson was lying, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. His story didn't add up. He had been near the camera, and Emma was sure that he knew more than he was letting on. But just as the prosecutor seemed ready to corner Mr. Johnson, something unexpected happened. "Objection, Your Honor," Mr. Grayson called out, standing up quickly. "The witness is not answering the questions directly, and he's evading crucial details. I request that he be asked to explain his involvement more thoroughly." The judge nodded, banging his gavel. "Sustained. Mr. Collins, please continue your questioning, but keep it relevant." The prosecutor looked frustrated, but pressed on. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his voice tight with control, "you were seen leaving Mr. Wilson's house the night he was attacked, weren't you?" Mr. Johnson seemed to shrink under the weight of the question. He looked over at the jury, his eyes filled with panic. "I didn't attack him," he shouted suddenly, his voice rising. "I didn't hurt him. I was just trying to scare him. He owed me money. That's all. It was just a stupid argument." The room went silent. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Mr. Johnson had just admitted it. He had been there. He had been the one to threaten Mr. Wilson. "Trying to scare him?" Mr. Collins asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Is that what you call it? Beating him within an inch of his life?" "I didn't mean to hurt him," Mr. Johnson cried out, his voice breaking. "It got out of hand. I just wanted him to pay me back, that's all. I didn't want to kill him. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. Please, The courtroom erupted into chaos as Mr. Johnson's confession hung in the air. Gasps filled the room, and Emma felt the blood rush to her head. This was it. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Mr. Johnson had just confessed to attacking Mr. Wilson, and he had just indirectly admitted that he had framed her father. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the room was still buzzing with shock and disbelief. Mr. Collins looked momentarily stunned, and Mr. Grayson's face remained calm, though Emma could see a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "Mr. Johnson, you will remain silent, unless called to the stand," the judge said sternly, his voice commanding the room's attention. "I will not tolerate further outbursts." Mr. Johnson slumped in his seat, his face ashen, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his own guilt. Emma watched him closely, her heart pounding. This was the turning point. The trial had taken a dramatic turn, and now the pieces were falling into place. But even as she felt the first glimmers of hope, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Mr. Johnson might have confessed, but something still didn't sit right with her. There were too many unanswered questions, and Emma knew that she couldn't stop now. She had come this far. For her father, for her family, she was determined to see the truth all the way through, no matter where it led. The courtroom was in a state of uproar after Mr. Johnson's outburst. People were talking over one another, speculating, and trying to make sense of the confession that had just been thrown into the mix. Emma sat frozen in her seat, clutching her bunny tightly, her mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. Mr. Johnson had confessed to being there the night of the attack on Mr. Wilson, but his words only opened the door to more questions. He had admitted to trying to intimidate Mr. Wilson over money, but he hadn't meant to hurt him. He had clearly lost control, and Emma couldn't ignore the fact that he was trying to distance himself from the brutal attack. But there was something else, something still lurking in the back of Emma's mind. Why had he been so evasive? Why had he lied about the details? And most importantly, how was he connected to her father's case? Her head spun as she processed everything. She had thought the trial would be a straightforward path once the truth started to come out, but now she realized that the situation was far from clear-cut. The moment Mr. Johnson had confessed, Emma had felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, but it was quickly replaced with an overwhelming sense of unease. The judge slammed his gavel to restore order, the sound reverberating through the courtroom. "Order in the court," he commanded. "Mr. Johnson, you will remain silent unless called to the stand again. The court will take a brief recess to assess the situation." Emma watched as Mr. Johnson's lawyer, a sharp-looking man who had been sitting quietly at the defense table, whispered furiously to his client. Mr. Johnson sat slumped in his chair, looking broken, his eyes wide with fear. For the first time since the trial began, Emma saw the true extent of the man's guilt. It was as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. Samantha, Emma's mother, sat beside her, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "This is it, Emma," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Your dad's coming home. This is the moment we've been waiting for." But Emma couldn't share her mother's optimism. Something was nagging at her, pulling her thoughts in a different direction. She couldn't let go of the feeling that there was more to the story. Mr. Johnson had confessed, but there had to be someone else involved. The way he had spoken, the way he had tried to deflect blame, made Emma think that he wasn't working alone. When the recess ended, the judge called the court back to order, and everyone settled into their seats. Mr. Collins, the prosecutor, stood up slowly, his face pale but determined. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "it seems we have a new development in the case. While Mr. Johnson's confession has undoubtedly shed light on some aspects of this attack, it raises more questions than answers. It seems that Mr. Johnson was not acting alone." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Had she been right all along? Was there more to uncover? "I have new evidence," Mr. Collins continued, "which I will now present to the court." The prosecutor motioned for an officer to bring forward a stack of papers and a set of photographs. He laid them out on the table, carefully presenting each one to the judge and the jury. Emma watched closely, her eyes narrowing as the documents were displayed. They were financial records, bank statements, transaction logs, and receipts. These documents show that in the weeks leading up to Mr. Wilson's attack, Mr. Collins explained, Mr. Johnson made several large withdrawals from his personal bank account. In addition, there are records of payments made to an unknown individual, who we believe is a second accomplice. The money involved points to a motive far beyond just a debt repayment. The room grew quiet as everyone processed the new information. Emma leaned forward, trying to make sense of the puzzle pieces. The financial records were damning, showing that Mr. Johnson had been involved in something much bigger than a simple neighborhood dispute. But who was this other accomplice? And why had Mr. Johnson been hiding their involvement? Mr. Collins turned to the jury. "These documents are evidence that Mr. Johnson was not acting on his own. We believe that he, along with another individual, carefully planned the attack on Mr. Wilson, and together they framed an innocent man, Mr. Mark Hargrave." Emma's stomach twisted at the mention of her father's name. The prosecutor was painting Mr. Johnson as a mere pawn in a larger conspiracy. Emma couldn't understand how this new accomplice fit into the equation. She had been so sure that they were close to the truth, but now this twist had thrown everything into chaos. As the prosecution laid out their case, Emma's mind began to race. She thought back to everything she had learned about Mr. Johnson's behavior, his movements, his lies. And then there was the strange, nagging feeling that someone else was involved. Was it possible that this accomplice had been someone they knew? Someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along? Mr. Grayson, Mark's defense lawyer, rose from his seat and approached the stand. "Your Honor, I request to cross-examine the prosecution's evidence," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We have a right to challenge these documents. They raise more questions than answers. It is unclear who this second accomplice is, and it is highly suspicious that the prosecution has failed to identify this individual until now." The judge nodded. "Very well. The defense may proceed with its cross-examination." Emma watched as Mr. Grayson began his questioning, carefully scrutinizing the evidence laid out by the prosecution. He seemed focused and composed, but Emma could tell he was taking in every detail, looking for holes in the case. The financial records were complex, and Emma could see how the defense would try to break them down, piece by piece. But as Mr. Grayson spoke, Emma's thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something crucial still missing. There was a name, an identity, she had to uncover, and she was determined to find it. The thought of her father's innocence resting on these financial documents didn't sit right with her. There was more to this than money. There was something deeper, something more personal, that had driven Mr. Johnson and his accomplice to attack Mr. Wilson. As the day wore on, Emma began to piece together a new theory. What if this second accomplice wasn't just a random criminal? What if it was someone from within the neighborhood? Someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along? The day's proceedings came to an end, and Emma stood up with her mother, her heart still racing. The case had shifted dramatically, and while they were closer to the truth, Emma knew that they hadn't reached the final answer yet. There were still too many unanswered questions. As they left the courthouse, Emma turned to her mother. "Mom, I think there's more to this. I think I know who the second accomplice is." Samantha looked at her daughter, her face a mixture of concern and surprise. "What do you mean?" "I think it's someone we all know," Emma said, her voice steady despite the storm swirling inside her. "I think we're closer than ever to the truth." And with that, Emma stepped out into the sunlight, her mind already working overtime, determined to uncover the last pieces of the puzzle. The truth was within reach, and she wouldn't stop until it was finally exposed. The day after the new revelation about the financial records, Emma couldn't stop thinking about the second accomplice. The idea that someone else, someone from within their neighborhood, might be involved was both chilling and strangely comforting. If Emma could figure out who it was, she could finally prove her father's innocence. But who could it be? Who would want to hurt Mr. Wilson? And, more importantly, who would want to frame her father? The courtroom buzzed with tension the next morning as the trial continued. Emma and her mother entered the courthouse with a new sense of urgency. The stakes had never been higher. They were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. But the pieces still weren't fitting together. She had to find out who this mysterious accomplice was, and fast. The courtroom was filled with lawyers, jurors, and reporters, all eager to hear the latest developments. Emma sat down at her usual spot, her bunny still firmly tucked under her arm, and her mind racing. Mr. Grayson was already at the defense table, quietly reviewing his notes. He looked up briefly and gave Emma an encouraging smile, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He was working around the clock to help her father, and she knew that he was doing everything he could to turn the tide in their favor. But even he seemed to be struggling with the latest curveball, the mysterious accomplice and the hidden financial records. Mr. Collins, the prosecutor, was standing at the front of the courtroom, looking like a man on a mission. He had been relentless throughout the trial, and today was no different. He was ready to present new evidence, but Emma could feel that there was something he was still hiding. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she knew there was more to the story than what had been revealed so far. The judge called the court to order, and the trial resumed. Mr. Collins stood and began his presentation, pointing out the new financial evidence. He painted a picture of Mr. Johnson as a desperate man, trying to cover up his tracks by paying off someone who might have been the true mastermind behind the attack on Mr. Wilson. But Emma's thoughts were elsewhere. Her mind kept returning to the question that had been haunting her since the night of the attack. Who was the second accomplice? She had been so focused on Mr. Johnson that she hadn't fully considered the possibility that this second person might be someone with an intimate connection to the case. What if it wasn't just a random criminal? What if it was someone who had a personal vendetta? As she sat there, her thoughts began to fall into place. Mr. Johnson had a history of arguments with Mr. Wilson over money. But money wasn't enough to explain the violence of the attack. Emma had overheard bits and pieces of conversations from the police officers earlier in the trial, and something about them had stuck with her. There had been talk of someone else being involved, someone who had been seen near the crime scene before the attack. The name hadn't been mentioned, but the feeling of something important being overlooked was growing stronger. Emma's mind clicked into place. What if the accomplice wasn't just a random neighbor? What if it was someone closer to home? Someone who knew Mr. Wilson well enough to make him feel comfortable enough to trust them? Her heart raced as she thought of someone, a name she had heard too many times but never really considered. What if it was Mr. Harris, the local handyman? He had been working for Mr. Wilson on and off for years, and they had always seemed friendly, if not a bit too close for comfort. He had been seen coming and going from Mr. Wilson's house in the days leading up to the attack. Emma had seen him outside on the night of the crime, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. The more she thought about it, the more she became convinced. Mr. Harris was the missing piece. He had the means, the opportunity, and the motive. If he was involved, he would have known exactly how to make it look like Mark was guilty. The more she considered it, the more certain she became. Emma had to act fast. During a break in the trial, Emma stood up and approached Mr. Grayson, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to tell him everything she was thinking. He was the only one who could help her connect the dots. "Mr. Grayson," she said quietly, tugging at his sleeve. He looked up, surprised but attentive. "Emma, what's wrong?" "I think I know who the second person is," she said, her voice urgent. "It's Mr. Harris, the handyman. He was always at Mr. Wilson's house, and I've seen him near the camera before. I think he's the one who helped Mr. Johnson." Mr. Grayson's brow furrowed, and he nodded slowly. "Mr. Harris, you say?" "Yes," Emma replied, her voice steady. "I've seen him around, and I remember seeing him on the night of the attack. I think he might be the one behind it all." Mr. Grayson's expression changed as he considered her words. "I'll look into it, Emma. You may have just given us the lead we need to turn this case around." Emma felt a surge of hope as Mr. Grayson turned away to make his phone call. He was taking her seriously. He was going to investigate Mr. Harris, and that could be the breakthrough they needed. Later that day, Mr. Grayson returned to the courtroom with a renewed sense of determination. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge, "I'd like to request that Mr. Harris be questioned about his possible involvement in this case. We have reason to believe he may be the second accomplice." The judge looked at Mr. Grayson, his expression serious. "Are you suggesting that Mr. Harris was involved in the attack on Mr. Wilson?" "We believe so, Your Honor," Mr. Grayson replied, his voice firm. "We have new evidence suggesting that he may have played a role in the crime, and we need to investigate this possibility further." The prosecutor, Mr. Collins, jumped to his feet, looking taken aback. "Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation. There's no evidence to suggest that Mr. Harris is involved in any way. The judge paused, his gavel hovering in the air. I'll allow it. Mr. Harris will be questioned, but I expect hard evidence, not assumptions. The courtroom fell silent as the judge made his ruling. Emma felt her heart race. She had done it. She had uncovered the missing piece of the puzzle. Mr. Harris was about to be dragged into the spotlight, and Emma could only hope that this would lead them to the truth. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable as Emma sat, anxiously clutching her bunny, waiting for the next phase of the trial to unfold. The judge had given his approval for Mr. Harris to be questioned, and Emma felt a sense of anticipation and fear rising in her chest. The moment of truth was almost upon them. She had no idea how it would play out, but she knew that everything depended on it. As the courtroom settled into an eerie silence, Mr. Grayson stood and walked toward the judge, his face calm but determined. He motioned toward Mr. Collins, the prosecutor, who had been visibly flustered by the unexpected developments in the case. Mr. Grayson was confident now. He had a lead. He had a name. And Emma, despite everything that had happened, couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. "Your Honor," Mr. Grayson began, his voice carrying across the quiet room, "we would like to call Mr. Harris, the local handyman, to the stand. We have reason to believe that he may have knowledge that could be crucial to this case." Mr. Collins shot to his feet, his objection quick and sharp. "Objection, Your Honor! There is no evidence linking Mr. Harris to the crime. This is pure speculation. We cannot allow this line of questioning to continue based on assumptions alone." The judge raised a hand, silencing the room with a quick, firm gesture. "I understand the objection, Mr. Collins, but I believe there is enough to warrant questioning. Mr. Harris will be brought forward." Emma's pulse quickened as she saw Mr. Harris, the local handyman, being escorted into the courtroom. He was a stocky man in his 40s, with calloused hands and a rough appearance. Emma had seen him around the neighborhood, working on various houses, fixing leaks, and doing odd jobs. But something about him had always felt off to her. Now, as he stood before the judge, his face unreadable, Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Could this man really be the second accomplice in the attack on Mr. Wilson? Mr. Harris took the witness stand, his eyes flickering nervously as he sat down. His lawyer, a quiet man with a grim expression, stood beside him, his eyes darting between the defense and the prosecution. "Mr. Harris," Mr. Grayson began, his tone even and professional, "you've been a handyman in this neighborhood for quite some time, correct?" "Yes," Harris muttered, his voice low and gruff. "I've worked here for years, helped out a lot of people." "Did you know Mr. Wilson well?" Mr. Grayson pressed. Harris hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. "I did some work for him here and there, a few repairs, nothing personal." Mr. Grayson nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "And did you ever have any disputes with Mr. Wilson? Any disagreements, perhaps?" At the mention of a dispute, Harris shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. "I didn't have any problems with him," he said, his voice rising defensively. "Just some business stuff. I fixed a leaky pipe a while back, and he didn't pay me right away. But that's all. Nothing serious." Mr. Grayson pressed on. "And you knew that Mr. Wilson was going through a difficult time, didn't you? Financial issues, arguments with some neighbors, some of whom had been helping him with repairs. Did that ever bother you?" Harris shifted uncomfortably in his chair again, his eyes flickering toward the prosecutor before he replied, "Look, I just did my job. I didn't get involved in his personal business." "Did you ever speak to Mr. Wilson about money?" Mr. Grayson asked. "Did you ever have any conversations about debts or payments?" Harris's face went pale. No, he replied quickly, shaking his head. I never talked to him about money. He paid me for the work I did, and that was it. Then why? Mr. Grayson continued, his voice steady. Did you make several large withdrawals from your personal bank account in the weeks leading up to Mr. Wilson's attack? Why were you making payments to an unknown individual, someone who is now believed to be involved in this crime? Harris's eyes widened, his face going pale. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. Those withdrawals weren't for anything illegal. I just had some expenses, personal stuff. The courtroom fell silent. Emma could feel the air thickening around her as Mr. Grayson turned to the judge, raising a set of bank statements and transaction logs in his hands. Your Honor, these are records from Mr. Harris's account. They show several suspicious withdrawals, including payments to an unknown individual. These payments match the time frame surrounding Mr. Wilson's attack. Harris's face went even paler, and Emma saw him break into a cold sweat as he glanced at the evidence. This is ridiculous, he muttered. I didn't do anything wrong. Mr. Grayson didn't back down. Mr. Harris, he said calmly, we know you were near Mr. Wilson's house the night of the attack, and we know you've been involved in other shady business around here. We believe you are not only linked to the crime, but may have played a significant role in it. Harris's eyes flickered nervously toward the prosecutor. I didn't hurt him, he shouted suddenly, his voice shaking with fear. I didn't mean to hurt him. I was just helping him out. And then it got out of hand. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. The courtroom erupted in chaos as Harris's words echoed through the room. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Harris had just confessed to being involved in Mr. Wilson's attack. He hadn't meant to hurt him, but he had, and now everything was beginning to fall into place. The judge quickly called for order. Mr. Harris, you will remain silent unless instructed to speak, he said sternly. We will reconvene after a brief recess. Emma's heart raced as she processed what had just happened. They were so close. Harris had confessed. He had been part of the attack, and his involvement had confirmed everything Emma had suspected. The case was finally unraveling, but there were still pieces of the puzzle left to uncover. Who was the mysterious person behind the payments? Who else was involved? As the recess was called, Emma turned to her mother, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mom, it's all starting to come together. I think we're almost there. Samantha squeezed Emma's hand, her face filled with a mixture of awe and fear. We are, Emma, she whispered. We're almost there. The courtroom had barely settled after the explosive confession from Mr. Harris when the judge called the court back into session. The air was thick with anticipation as Emma, her heart pounding, sat with her mother, clutching her bunny tightly. The moment they had all been waiting for was finally within reach, but Emma knew that there was still one last hurdle to clear. Mr. Harris had confessed to his involvement in the attack on Mr. Wilson, but the question of who had been behind the payments, and why, still loomed large. Emma watched as Mr. Harris was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he was led away. He had confessed to being part of the crime, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. Harris hadn't been acting alone. The name of the other accomplice still eluded her, but Emma knew deep down that they were close. Mr. Grayson, Mark's defense lawyer, stood to address the court. Your Honor, he said calmly, his voice steady, we believe the confession from Mr. Harris provides us with enough information to request a recess for further investigation into the remaining accomplice. We have reason to believe that the individual responsible for financing Mr. Harris's involvement in this crime is still at large. The judge nodded thoughtfully. The request is granted, he said. This court will reconvene tomorrow at the same time for further investigation. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the session ended, but Emma barely noticed. Her mind was racing. Mr. Harris's confession had exposed a significant part of the crime, but there was still so much left unanswered. The financial records that had pointed to an unknown individual, someone Harris had been paying, could be the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. If they could just identify who was behind the payments, they could finally put the whole puzzle together. That evening, Emma couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, her mind filled with questions. Who had been paying Mr. Harris? Why hadn't the prosecutor or the defense discovered this person earlier? She knew the answers were close, but they were still just out of reach. And then, as she lay there staring at the ceiling, a thought suddenly occurred to her. What if the person who was financing Harris's involvement in the crime wasn't just someone in the neighborhood, but someone much closer to home? Emma bolted upright in bed. Could it be? Could the person responsible be someone she knew? Someone from her own family? She didn't want to believe it, but the more she thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit. The financial records had shown that Mr. Harris had made payments to someone, but the transactions were listed under a name that didn't match any known individual in the area. Could it be someone who had been hiding in plain sight? She slipped out of bed and quietly grabbed her diary. She flipped through the pages, scanning her notes from the past few months. Everything she had written about the case, the clues she had uncovered, the conversations she had overheard, all of it led her back to the same question. Who was behind this? Who was the person pulling the strings? As Emma turned a page, her eyes landed on a note she had written just a few weeks ago. It was a detail she had nearly forgotten, a conversation she had overheard between her mother and Mr. Grayson in the kitchen one evening. Emma had been playing in the living room when she had heard her name mentioned. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the conversation had caught her attention. "It's just so strange," Samantha had said to Mr. Grayson. "I don't know what to think anymore. How could someone we've known for so long be involved in something like this? How could they have kept it a secret?" Mr. Grayson had replied, his voice low, "You need to trust that the truth will come out, Sarah. It always does, even if it takes time." Sarah. Emma's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the mention of her mother's name that had caught her attention. It was the tone in Mr. Grayson's voice. There had been something in the way he had spoken, something that hinted at more than just the surface-level conversation. Could it be possible? Could her mother, someone she trusted more than anyone, be unknowingly connected to this whole mess? Emma felt a cold chill settle over her. She couldn't believe it. Her mother had always been the one to support her, to stand by her side. She had never once thought that her own mother could be linked to the crime, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had never been given all the details. There were still things she didn't know about her mother's past, things that might explain why Mr. Harris had been involved. Emma couldn't let her suspicion go unchecked. She had to know the truth. The next morning, Emma sat quietly in the courtroom, trying to mask the unease that had settled in her chest. She couldn't look at her mother the same way anymore. What if the truth was something far darker than she had ever imagined? The judge called the session to order, and the trial continued. Mr. Collins, the prosecutor, stood to address the court, his voice full of resolve. "Your Honor, we have been investigating the financial records and have managed to identify the person responsible for the payments made to Mr. Harris. This individual has been linked to the crime and is now a primary suspect in the case." The prosecutor's words cut through the air like a knife. Emma leaned forward, her heart racing as she waited for the name of the person who had been funding the crime. Mr. Collins paused dramatically before speaking the name that would change everything. "It is," he said, "a former associate of Mr. Wilson's, none other than Sarah Hargrave, the mother of the defendant." The room went silent. The air seemed to freeze around Emma. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the blood rushing to her head. She looked over at her mother, who sat frozen in her seat, her face pale, her hands trembling. It couldn't be. It couldn't be true. But the evidence was there, and there was no denying it. Emma's world was shattering as she realized that the person who had been unknowingly linked to the crime was her own mother. The courtroom was silent. The words that had just been spoken reverberated in Emma's mind, over and over. Sarah Hargrave, the mother of the defendant. Her world seemed to slow down as she turned to look at her mother. Samantha's face was ashen, her eyes wide with shock and something else, something darker. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, a mix of disbelief and fear overwhelming her senses. How could this be? How could her mother, her rock, the one person who had always been there for her, be involved in all of this? The prosecutor, Mr. Collins, had just named Sarah Hargrave as the person behind the financial transactions that had linked Mr. Harris to the attack on Mr. Wilson. Emma could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, the truth crashing over her like a tidal wave. But despite the shock, one part of her mind refused to give in completely. Her mother had always been a good person. She had to have a reason that made sense, even if it didn't seem clear right now. Samantha remained motionless, staring straight ahead. Emma could feel the tension building in the room, the eyes of everyone on them, on her mother, waiting for an explanation. The judge called for order, but the murmurs in the courtroom continued, spreading like wildfire. "Ms. Hargrave," the judge finally said, his voice stern but filled with a surprising amount of compassion, "I must ask you to stand and address the court." Samantha slowly rose to her feet, her hands trembling as she reached for the edge of the defense table to steady herself. She had always been composed, always so strong. But now, standing before the court, she looked smaller than Emma had ever seen her. Her eyes met Emma's, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Samantha's gaze was filled with sadness, regret, and a strange kind of fear, as if the weight of a secret she had carried for so long had finally caught up with her. "Mom?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's going on? Why didn't you tell me?" Samantha opened her mouth as though to speak, but closed it again. She swallowed hard and looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor. Finally, she turned back to Emma, her eyes filled with tears. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said, her voice hoarse. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to be part of this. But the truth is, I've made mistakes. I've done things I'm not proud of." Emma's heart twisted in her chest. She wanted to understand, wanted to hear the whole story, but a part of her couldn't reconcile the mother she had known with the one standing in front of the court now, accused of involvement in a crime. Samantha took a deep breath, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Before I met your father, I had another life, a different life. I was involved with people who weren't good people. They had connections, money, and influence. But when I met Mark, I wanted to leave that behind. I wanted to be a good person. For you. For us. I thought I could put it all in the past. But—" Her voice cracked, and she looked down at the floor, as though ashamed of her own words. "When Mr. Wilson got into trouble, he reached out to me for help. He knew about my past, and he knew I could help him. He asked for money. money he needed to get out of debt, and I gave it to him. Emma's mind was racing. Was that all it took to bring her mother back into this world she had left behind? But there had to be more to it. Emma could feel it in her gut. Something was missing. Samantha continued, her voice barely a whisper. But I didn't know what he was planning. I didn't know he was going to do something like that to him. When I found out, I tried to distance myself. I cut off all contact. I didn't want to be part of it anymore. But it was too late. The realization hit Emma like a punch to the gut. Her mother hadn't been the mastermind. She hadn't known that Mr. Wilson was going to hurt Mr. Harris, but she had given him the money, the means to do so, and that had made her just as complicit as the others. She wasn't innocent. No one was. But her mother hadn't been the one to make the final decision. She had gotten caught up in something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. The prosecutor, Mr. Collins, stood up again, his voice cold and measured. Your Honor, we have established that Ms. Hargrave's involvement was indirect, but the evidence is clear. She funded Mr. Harris's participation in the crime, and she played a significant role in covering up the truth. Emma felt the room closing in on her as Mr. Grayson stood up to defend her mother. Your Honor, he said, his tone firm but respectful, while Ms. Hargrave's actions are not to be excused, we must understand that she did not orchestrate the attack. She was manipulated into helping a man with whom she had a troubled history. We request that her involvement be taken into account, but that she be treated with mercy in light of the circumstances. The judge looked down at his notes, and the room was quiet, waiting for his decision. Emma's breath caught in her throat as he finally spoke. Ms. Hargrave, the judge said, your actions have led to the suffering of another individual, but it is clear that you did not intend for harm to come of it. While I cannot overlook your involvement in this crime, I believe that the circumstances and your intent warrant a sentence less severe than that of the other parties involved. I hereby recommend a sentence that focuses on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Samantha closed her eyes, and Emma felt a tear slip down her cheek. It wasn't justice that could undo what had been done, but it was something. It was a step toward healing, toward putting everything back together. The trial continued, and Mark's case began to shift. With the full truth now out in the open, the evidence against him faded, and the charges were gradually dropped. Mr. Harris and his accomplices were arrested, their fates sealed by their own actions. As the weeks passed, the Hargrave family began to heal. Mark was released, the charges against him cleared. The trial had been a long, drawn-out battle, but in the end, Emma knew that the truth had prevailed. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Mark turned to Emma, his face filled with gratitude and love. You did it, kiddo. You never gave up on me. You fought for the truth, and I'm so proud of you. Emma smiled, her heart full of emotion. We fought together, Dad, she said softly. We found the truth, and that's all that matters. Samantha reached across the table, squeezing Emma's hand. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, she said quietly. I made mistakes, but I will spend the rest of my life making it right. Emma looked at both of her parents, the love and pain in their eyes, and she realized something. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be scars, there would be healing, but they were a family again. They had faced the unimaginable and come out on the other side, stronger and together. And no matter what the future held, Emma knew one thing for sure. The truth had set them free.